Hey everyone, Nick Marzinski here at TrappingLight.com. In the past tutorials that I've done on Lightroom, I've covered how to import your images into the library module as well as how to sort them. Now that I have a group of images sorted with the best ones selected, which you can see down here on the film strip at the bottom of the monitor here, I'm going to move into the optimizing stage, which is, for me, the best part of using Lightroom because Lightroom takes a really powerful and non-destructive editing tool, namely Adobe's Camera Raw engine, and puts it into a really spectacular interface in the Develop module. So I'm going to be spending quite a few tutorials in that Develop module talking about all it can do because there's quite a bit. So let's get started. Right now I'm in the Library module. Right up here you can see that it's set to Library, and I have my collection set selected. So I've got the flower picks that I set up in the prior tutorial. I've got all of my images that are flagged here, and this is the first image that I'm going to be working on. Once I've gotten to this point, now is when I switch to the Develop module. So I'm going to just click on the Develop module, and it's going to switch the screen over. And this is, for the most part, where you're going to be doing your editing in Lightroom. Now you can see that it's completely changed the right hand and the left hand windows. Okay, on the left hand of I still have the film strip on the bottom, but on the left hand of my screen, I've got my presets, snapshots, histories, and collection panels, and I'll get into those in a later tutorial. On the right side here, I've got a histogram as well as my editing panels, and this is where I'm going to be spending all of my time in this tutorial and in many future tutorials as well, because this is where you're going to be doing most of your work. Okay, and when you're editing in Lightroom, now Lightroom is predominantly a raw editing tool. You can use it to edit JPEGs, but it is really good at raw editing. And when I'm talking about today, when I'm talking about my process for editing in Lightroom, I'm going to be talking about editing raw. If you're shooting JPEGs, where you should be starting out is in the basic panel here, and this is what I'm going to be covering in more detail in the next tutorial. But if you're shooting raw, I would not actually recommend starting out here. Where you're going to want to probably start out is in the camera calibration panel, and here's why. We need to talk a little bit about what's the difference between JPEG and RAW, because the way that that image is captured and written to your card makes a big difference in how you're going to approach editing it. When you're shooting in JPEG mode, your camera is applying a bunch of settings to the image after it's captured by the sensor and prior to writing it to the card. And these settings are baked into the image. You can't undo them. And some of the settings include things like sharpening and saturation and color tones. Basically, think of it as the digital equivalent of a different film type, okay? The JPEG image is baking all of that into it. So once you open it in your editor in Lightroom, for example, there's a lot of decisions and a lot of choices have already been made for you. Okay, if you're shooting RAW, however, most of those settings that I talked about don't get applied. Your camera simply records the image on the sensor, includes some of the information about the image, such as the white balance, as metadata, and then writes that full sensor output and metadata to the card. And the advantage to doing it this way, well, there's a couple. But the first is that you have, first of all, way more data to work with. And when we start moving into the basic panel and talking about things like setting a white point and black point and contrast and exposure, having all of that data makes a big difference. The second advantage, however, is that all of the settings that are baked into a JPEG image are completely malleable in a RAW image. We can change them any way that we want. However, that comes with a bit of an issue is that none of the settings, none of the sharpening settings and the contrast curves and all that sort of stuff that gets automatically applied to a JPEG image, none of that is applied to a RAW image. And because of that, RAW images can sometimes look kind of washed out or flat. And that's why I start with camera calibration, because it can introduce some of those changes and allow me to specifically choose what kind of image I want. With camera calibration, in this panel, I can choose two things. I can look at the process and I can look at the profile. The process right here determines what kind of editing tools I'm going to have. Adobe periodically updates their Camera Raw engine. The last time they did it was in Lightroom 4 with a 2012 process. That's the most current process. However, you can also select the 2003 process and the 2010 process. The only reason that I can think of why you would want to select one of these earlier ones is if you've done edits in a prior version of Lightroom or Camera Raw and you wanted to be able to get to that same point. In that case, choosing one of these earlier ones, the one that you used to originally edit the image, can really be a good way of getting to the endpoint that you got with that image. However, for the most part, you should be working with the most current process version. And the reason is because you've got the best possible tools at your disposal here. So when it comes to working in the camera calibration tab, I never change the process. The profile drop down, however, here is where I start out. And whenever you shoot a raw image, the profile is going to default to Adobe Standard. If you're shooting a JPEG image, it's going to default to embedded. And it's an embedded with a JPEG image because all of this has already been sent and you don't have any of these options available to you with a JPEG image. You just simply have this embedded profile and that's it. With a raw image, you have options that are available, and these options are based on the camera that you're shooting with. So the options that I have here are options that I see because I shot it with a Canon. If you shot with a different camera, you may get different options in this menu, but these align with the kind of options that your camera will have in terms of setting things like a landscape format or a portrait format or standard. Sometimes there's vivid on here, that sort of thing. So it's all dependent on the camera that you shoot with, and again, you have to be shooting with RAW. When I get here and I'm editing, generally what I do is I simply just click through them and see what each of these profiles does to my image and look at which ones I like the best. And generally, for me, the two that I end up using the most are camera landscape and camera portrait. And if I had to choose between the two now, I think that camera landscape, well, actually I'm kind of leaning towards camera portrait because I like how it's sort of darkening some of these areas over here. Camera landscape makes it a little bit brighter in the background, and I really don't want to call attention to it. So in this case, I think that camera portrait is working out well. So once I've got my profile set, and then here it's set to camera portrait, now I'm going to hop back to the basic panel and set my white balance. Okay, now since I'm shooting with RAW, in addition to being able to manage my camera profile, I can also non-destructively set my white balance. So if you're shooting in JPEG, your white balance is set for you. If you're shooting in RAW, it's not. However, your camera does record the white balance that you use to shoot the image, which is why this white balance here is set to as shot. That means that this is the temperature setting and this is the tint setting that my camera used when it shot this image. Okay, and there's quite a few tools that you've got here at your disposal. First of all, you've got sliders that you can play around with. So you can drop the temperature and make it appear more blue, or increase the temperature and make it appear warmer or biased towards the yellow. I can also change the tint and bias it either towards the green or towards the magenta. However, as I said, it's completely non-destructive. If I double click on this white balance, it's always going to return me to as shot. So I've always got an undo method anywhere in the editing process. In addition to using the sliders, I've also got options here that mirror the kind of options that I would have using a white balance selector in my camera. So I can take a look and see what it would look like if I shot it with a daylight white balance, or cloudy, or tungsten, which really looks pretty blue, or whatever I want. So these actually work pretty well, either using the sliders or using the white balance selector here. However, the way that's the easiest and the quickest is to just simply use the white balance selector here, this eyedropper tool. So I click on it, and I drag and I move the icon. Once I click on it, I don't even have to drag it. I just can move my mouse out here and look for an area that gives a pretty good neutral gray. In this case, there's really not a whole lot in this image that'll do it, but right here I can get some pretty good neutral colors. I just click once, and the white balance is selected. If I don't like what it looks like, I can just try another point and keep clicking around until I get something that gives me a color, a temperature, and a tint, and a white balance that I'm happy with. Okay. Now, again, this is with a raw image. If you're shooting JPEG, you'll still have the sliders here and you'll still have the white balance tool, so you can still use them. However, all of these options in your drop down here will not be there. You'll only be able to choose as shot because, again, the white balance has already been baked into a JPEG image. So Now that I've gotten through this point, I've pretty much set my camera calibration, I've set my white balance. Now I'm ready to actually start optimizing my image. However, here's where I'm going to end it today. And you'll notice that I really haven't even bothered to talk about things like exposure or contrast or white points or black points or that sort of thing. And the reason why I start out with the camera calibration and the white balance before jumping into other edits is because those two edits set the overall tonality of the image. And before adjusting anything else, I want that tonality to be dialed into place. As I've said before, Lightroom is completely non-destructive, so any changes I make here I can undo or change at any point in the process. But if I've already adjusted my exposure or contrast or saturation and then decide that I want to adjust my calibration settings or my white balance, I may end up, after making those changes to the calibration or the white balance, I may end up needing to go back to the basic panel and adjust my exposure and contrast. Okay, so for me, starting with a calibration and the white balance is just the best way to start, because once I've got that set, I know that any other changes I make to my image with my calibration and white balance set will only have to be done once. So I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial and that you'll stop back when I post the next one on exposure and contrast, because there's a lot that goes on with those things. And that's really exciting, being able to watch your image basically transform right in front of your eyes. If you have any questions about what came up in this tutorial, please feel free to leave them either in the comment section of my YouTube channel or on my blog at trappinglight.com. Again, my name is Nick Marzinski. Thanks for watching.